Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 833, and today is September 4th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, but before I get into that, we have a sponsor for the show. For the next month and a half or so, the Expat Money Summit 2025 will be sponsoring both Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone show. So they are doing so much for me. Make sure you head on over to expatmoneysummit.com and claim your free ticket for the Expat Money Summit. It's an online event. It's taking place from October 10th through October 12th. Additionally, if you want a VIP ticket to the event, that gives you access to exclusive panels, the ability to rewatch any of the talks that were available for free at a later date. You could use the promo code Kyle, K-Y-L-E, and you will get 20% off at checkout. This year, just like last year, I will be speaking on one of the VIP panels for the summit. So if you want to be able to catch my contribution to the Expat Money Summit 2025, be sure you use that promo code Kyle and sign up. Not only does it get you a discount, it lets them know that you heard about the show through me, or the summit through me, so that definitely helps out. Again, Expat Money Summit 2025, October 10th through the 12th, and you sign up at expatmoneysummit.com. And with that, I'm just going to get into the show today. Remind everybody to check out my ads at Kyle _. About 200 followers short of 10,000. And of course, that's where you can find all my work, all the articles I write, whether it's for the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, or judgedap.com. And both the shows, Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone Show. All right, let's get rolling. U.S. conducts lethal strikes against vessel near Venezuela. President Donald Trump said U.S. forces in the Caribbean shot out a boat after it left Venezuela. Washington has deployed several warships to the region and is preparing to conduct strikes inside Venezuela. During the press conference on Tuesday, Trump told reporters that U.S. forces literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat. We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country, coming in for a very long time, and these came out of Venezuela and coming out very heavily from Venezuela. A lot of things are coming out of Venezuela, so we took it out. Secretary of State Marco Rubio added context to the strike, claiming the boat was carrying drugs. Today, the U.S. military conducted a lethal strike in the southern Caribbean against a drug vessel, which had departed Venezuela and was being operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization. Tuesday's lethal attack followed a month-long U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. The U.S. has deployed 3 guided missile destroyers, an attack submarine, and approximately 4,000 Marines to the region. On Sunday, the Marines kicked off war games in Puerto Rico. The Financial Times reported that the Trump administration is also considering strikes inside of Venezuela. The outlet explained, one possibility highlighted by experts is that Trump may decide to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles from Navy destroyers or the submarine at targets inside Venezuela. These could include cocaine-producing laboratories or bases for the Colombian Marxist guerrillas involved in the drug trade and operating in Venezuela. After Donald Trump returned to the White House in January, the State Department began listing Latin American cartels as terrorist organizations. Earlier this year, Trump signed a secret order authorizing the Pentagon to target designated Latin American cartels on foreign soil and in international waters. In July, the State Department added Cartel de los Soles to a terror as a terror organization and claimed Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was the leader of the gang. However, there is limited evidence that Cartel de los Soles is a structured organization led by Maduro. Last week, Axios reported a U.S. official said the goal of Venezuela could be removing Maduro from power. The White House official said this could be Noriega Part 2. And this, of course, is referring to the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, where we arrested Noriega, the Panamanian president, and that was a little regime change operation there. So Maduro has responded by pledging to defend Venezuela and mobilizing millions of militia troops. Now, a couple things that I want to point out here. One is this idea that we could claim that there's drugs in a boat and just bomb it and attack it. Make no effort at an arrest. It would be one thing, right? If this was maybe the Coast Guard and it saw a boat carrying drugs in international waters, it suspected those drugs were coming to the United States. So the Coast Guard took action to attempt to take over the vessel. And look, like, if those gang members fired on the Coast Guard vessel, then the Coast Guard fires back. And look, I'm not saying that I necessarily support that, but that's an understandable circumstances of events. Here you have drug smuggling, which is a law enforcement order. It is not a military issue, right? But we are going to just start bombing and shooting these people, not even trying to arrest them. Clearly, this is just executions authorized by Donald Trump. He said that he authorized this attack. So that's very disturbing. Part two, and I'm not sure how much of this part that Trump truly understands, there is this idea that this is all about stopping drugs from entering the U.S. However, most drugs entering the U.S. are not coming via Venezuela. The kind of unique thing, if you look, I think about 90% of the drugs entering the U.S. come up the Pacific, not the Caribbean. And so that would mean a country like Colombia or Peru are going to be far more responsible for the drugs entering the U.S. than Venezuela. The unique thing about Venezuela compared to those other South American countries is that Colombia is a major non-NATO U.S. ally. Peru, I know there's a lot of changes in the government there, but during the first Trump administration, the Peruvian government was helping the U.S. to overthrow the Venezuelan government. I think it was actually called the Lima Group, named after the capital of Peru, that was putting together the regime change, the overthrow plot, the backing of Juan Guaido against Maduro. And so I don't think this is even remotely about stopping drug smuggling, combating cartels, or anything like that. I think this is purely about geopolitics. Marco Rubio has long sought to have a regime change of the communist government of Venezuela. And look, I'm a libertarian. I am not a communist. If I were a Venezuelan, I would not want to live under their communist government system. That being said, I'm a libertarian. I don't think that we dictate how other people live around the world. I don't think we go around the world looking for governments that we say are not doing right by their people and then overthrowing those governments. Obviously, if this was the case, if we are just waging wars based on human rights, we would be waging a war on Israel, not aiding Israel in their war on Gaza. So this is absolutely appalling what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela. This was one of my big fears of having Marco Rubio, not only as Secretary of State as he initially was, but now as National Security Advisor. Now, Trump has largely, it seems, let at least Steve Witkoff, his personal envoy, be the public face of the talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin or with Israel, right, to try to get them to end the war in the Middle East. And so Witkoff has taken on some of the bigger foreign policy portfolios, but this has led to Marco Rubio, it seems, in the catbird seat when it comes to Latin America. And Rubio really, really, really wants regime change. He's long sought it in Venezuela, and I would not be surprised if the U.S. does go for it. Look, before the White House even official was comparing what we could do in Venezuela to Panama in 1989, I was saying that they're going to try to Noriega Maduro. And so I am very concerned about this. And it gets even worse. And that story I had, this one from the Institute on September 3rd. Hegseth, Maduro should be worried. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth threatened to go to war with Venezuela and promised the Pentagon would continue to conduct military operations against alleged Latin American cartels. In an interview with Fox News on Wednesday, Hegseth said, "The only person that should be worried is Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who is effectively the kingpin of a narco state. The Trump administration claims Maduro is the leader of multiple cartels designated as terrorist organizations. President Donald Trump has authorized the military to target suspected members of cartels, and Hegseth said the U.S. will conduct more strikes in addition to the one that the U.S. conducted on Tuesday that Trump claimed killed 11 members of a cartel. He said, "We've got assets in the air, assets in the water, assets on ships, because this is a deadly serious mission for us, and it won't stop with just this strike. Anyone else trafficking in those waters who know we is a designated narco-terrorist will face the same fate." The Financial Times has reported that the Trump administration is also considering strikes inside of Venezuela. This is very, very concerning. Now, let's move on and discuss the situation in Ukraine. U.S. approves $330 million military sale to Ukraine. The U.S. State Department approved 2 foreign military sales to Ukraine, totaling $329 million. The Trump administration did not disclose how the deals will be funded. According to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the State Department approved the sale of spare parts and upgrades to the Patriot missile defense system. Raytheon, or RTX, will be the primary contractor on the deal at $179 million. Additionally, the U.S. authorized an additional $150 million in Starlink services for the Ukrainian military. The primary contractor, SpaceX, is owned by Elon Musk, a Trump donor turned rival. The Starlink communication services and the defenses provided by the Patriot systems have been key to the Ukrainian military successes. The sale follows the announcement that the U.S. would send Ukraine thousands of cruise missiles. The 3,350 ERAM missiles will be funded by the U.S. and several European nations. The U.S. support will come through foreign military financing. So important here, while the Trump administration is trying to downplay and say that we are only having the Ukrainians fund the weapons that we are now selling the Ukrainians, there have been a couple occasions where the State Department or the Defense Department have admitted that there is some U.S. funding going to the weapons, going to the Ukraine. It's just not that they're disclosing the dollar amounts, and they're trying to make it out to be that the Europeans are picking up most of the tab for the weapon sales. I'm not sure how true this is, exactly what percentage of this the U.S. is paying for at this point. So with a range of up to 280 miles, the ERAMs will be the longest range weapon the U.S. has provided to Ukraine. The transfer could suggest that Kiev will attempt another offensive in the future. President Donald Trump recently criticized Ukraine for only engaging in defensive tactics, comparing the war to a sports game, saying you need to go on offense to win. I think this is really a different situation where Ukraine probably was better off not conducting their last offensive, and had they played more defense, it would have given them a better position at the negotiating table. This isn't a sports game where you're trying to tally up points. This is a war. This is reality. And so, you know, if you're only playing defense, that's the best thing you could do. If you could inflict more blows on Russia, only playing defense, Ukraine was never going to get back all of its territory anyways. They were always going to be seen as the losers of this conflict. The real question is, how much territory is Ukraine going to lose? And playing defense would probably help them to lose less territory. All right, next up here, this one from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com, September 1st. And as you guys know, I do work at antiwar.com, and antiwar.com is holding a fundraiser right now. So if you want to head on over to antiwar.com/donate and help us out today, that would be greatly appreciated. So this one, NATO commander urges more U.S. arms makers to test their weapons in Ukraine. A U.S. Air Force general who serves as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe is urging more U.S. weapons to test their military equipment on the battlefield in Ukraine. So the general said, those few that have tried it have either learned a lot or they decided to go home because they can't compete in that environment, but that is going to be the environment that we face. So, a Ukrainian government-backed tech firm recently launched a program for foreign defense contractors to apply to test weapons technology on the battlefield and has received dozens of applications. Since the start of the proxy war, Ukrainian officials have earned Western arms makers to send their weapons into the war by framing it as an opportunity to test the equipment against a near-peer competitor. And this just goes to show, it's another example that this isn't about Ukraine. This isn't about helping the Ukrainians. It's about the West preparing for a future war against Russia. All right. Next up here, Trump offers to send more troops to Poland. So, Trump met with the new Polish president, Karol Nawrocki, and he told them that, hey, if you want some more troops, I'm happy to send more troops into Poland. The U.S. already has about 10,000 troops in Poland. Multiple Polish leaders have suggested creating a Fort Trump in Poland. This is an idea that was first rolled out during the first Trump administration. I think the idea was to make sure that Donald Trump didn't remove any U.S. troops from Poland. This is basically to appease the president's ego, to appeal to the president in that way. My guess is that Donald Trump will not remove any troops from Poland and probably not from Europe during this administration. He actually added 1,000 troops to Poland during his first term. Those troops were not deployed from the U.S. They were redeployed from Germany. Now, in his presser with the Polish president, Trump also made mention that the war in Ukraine has been more difficult to end than he expected, and went on to tout all the wars that he has ended, not necessarily discussing the wars he started, like those in Iran, Venezuela, Yemen. All right. Moving on here, another article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Trump accuses Xi, Putin, Kim of conspiring against the U.S. at military parade. As Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted more than 20 world leaders in Beijing for a parade commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, President Trump accused the Chinese leader, along with Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, of conspiring against the U.S. Trump wrote on Truth Social on Tuesday night, "The big question to be answered is whether or not Xi of China will be mentioned in the massive amount of support and the blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it to secure its freedom from a very unfriendly foreign invader. Many Americans died in China's request for victory and glory. I hope they are rightfully honored and remembered for their bravery and sacrifice. May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." Now, I want to give some more context here because I don't think Trump understands this, but this is probably important to the Chinese understanding of current world events. So, Imperial Japan, of course, occupied a lot of China during World War II. The Imperial Japanese were absolutely brutal to the colonies that they had. The Koreans, the Chinese, suffered immensely under Japanese rule. Now, the U.S. did go to war against Japan in World War II, and in part of that, they did help to liberate or remove although the Soviets had a role in it too, removing the Japanese military presence from mainland China. This, it is certainly important. The problem is now that the U.S. is aligning with the Japanese, working with the Japanese to prepare for a future war against China. And so when Trump is bringing up that there was this very unfriendly foreign invader in China during World War II, I'm sure to the Chinese, they look at that and they say, well, you are now preparing that foreign invader for a potential future war against us. So I think that's probably fairly problematic from the Chinese side. Now, another couple of things worth mentioning here, that other foreign leaders involved in the summit were the president of Iran, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Slovakia. So minus Slovakia, a lot of the countries on the, because Slovakia is a member of NATO, many of the countries on this list are on the official enemies list of the United States of America. And I think it's important to note here that, you know, Kim kind of joining this alternative world order, I think is going to be a real signal and a real step towards the collapse of the US led economic world order, where we were able to sanction and punish countries because everything ran through the dollar, because everything ran through Washington, because you couldn't do business, you couldn't be a thriving country without being a part of the US led economic world order. I think that's no longer true. And while it's probably been true for some time now, a few years now, this parade, this event is going to kind of represent a turning point when it became very clear to the world that this was the case. All right, next up here, Netanyahu says Trump told him no partial deals, go with full force in Gaza. So, at a security cabinet meeting on Sunday night, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told his top cabinet officials that he had the backing of President Trump to reject a temporary Gaza ceasefire deal and escalate to full military operations in Gaza. So, Netanyahu said, forget the partial deals, go with full force, finish it, Netanyahu said, relaying what Trump told him. Hamas recently accepted a proposal for a 60-day ceasefire, which would the two sides are meant to negotiate a long-term truce, and 10 Israeli captives would be released. The U.S. and Israel previously proposed a virtually identical deal, but despite that, Israel hasn't responded and is pushing ahead with a massive escalation over Gaza City. Israel never wanted a deal. Hamas agreed to concessions to basically agree to the Israeli deal, which Israel is now rejecting. I'm guessing they only proposed the deal because they didn't think Hamas would agree to it, and once Hamas did, they're not responding to it because they never intended to agree to it in the first place. So what Israel's plan to do in Gaza next is very concerning, very disturbing, and they are going to expel a lot of Palestinians. This article here I wrote for the Institute on September 1st. Trump consults with his top advisors on plan to expel Palestinians, rebuild Gaza. President Donald Trump met with his top advisors and former UK leader Tony Blair to discuss implementing a proposal to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, then develop several cities, including a massive resort area dubbed the Riviera of the Middle East. The Washington Post first reported on Sunday that Trump met with Blair, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, envoy Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law Jared Kushner about the Gaza Reconstruction, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation Trust, or the Great Trust. The Great Trust would see the Palestinians paid to leave Gaza, then rebuilding the Strip into several sectors, including an electric vehicle hub and a tourist area. The tourist area will span Gaza's coastline and is called the Riviera of the Middle East, referring to Trump's suggestion made during his first meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Great Trust was developed by the Israelis who created the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and financial work was completed by a team at the Boston Consulting Group. The BCG says the two senior partners that designed the proposal without consulting the firm and were fired. The GHF, which was established to distribute food in Gaza, is largely considered a failure and has been condemned as a tool of Israel's ongoing genocide. Contractors who worked for the GHF had denounced the agency for failing to distribute food and contributing to Israel's killing of civilians. Palestinian landowners will be offered a digital token for their land, while there will be a promise that Palestinians can eventually redeem the token in exchange for an apartment in one of the AI-powered smart cities to be built in Gaza. It remains unclear when the structures will be constructed And I also have an issue here with the AI-powered smart cities. I've read some about these. These are going to be highly, highly surveilled areas. These will not be in any way a recognizable city or somewhere where somebody will want to live. It'll be like a little bit of a high-tech prison. Palestinians who remain in Gaza will be forced in secure zones. The Great Trust proposes pushing Palestinians to leave the Strip with promises of a $5,000 payment, food for a year, and a stipend for 4 years' rent. The rebuilding in Gaza and the relocation of the Palestinians would be paid for by the Great Trust. The trust will get its initial funding by seizing the 30% of Gaza that is publicly owned, and Washington will hold the trusteeship for the first 10 years. The proposal will likely mean stiff resistance from Israelis, Palestinians, and the international community. The plan would oversee the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which is a violation of international law, and Palestinians want to remain in Gaza and maintain control of their homeland. And then many Israeli leaders have rejected any solution in Gaza that does not maintain Tel Aviv's control over the Strip, which it doesn't appear the Great Trust Plan does. So, top genocide scholars conclude Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. This is the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and they passed a resolution last week that condemned Israel for committing war crimes in Gaza. The statement said, recognizing that since the horrific Hamas-led attack on October 7, 2023, which in itself constitutes international crimes, the government of Israel has engaged in systematic and widespread crimes against humanity, and war crimes and genocide, including the indiscriminate and deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Now, I think these statements are important because with each one, it becomes less and less difficult for the pro-Israeli propagandists to use the anti-Semitic argument. Oh, you just hate Israel. No, we hate genocide. We hate when large number of innocent people are being killed. And as an American, I especially hate when that's being done on my dollar and with American weapons. All right, so next up here, Israel expects new military operations in Gaza to displace 1 million Palestinians. The Israeli military is anticipating forcing 1 million Palestinians from their homes and temporary shelters as it ramps up military operations across Gaza. A journalist briefed on the Israeli military plans for Gaza said an IDF official explained that Tel Aviv is expecting to displace 1 million Palestinians. A senior military official said that over 70,000 Palestinians have already fled their homes. Around 2 million Palestinians live in Gaza and many have been displaced multiple times. The UN estimates that 1 million Palestinians are currently sheltering in Gaza City. The IDF recently announced evacuation orders for Gaza City, demanding that people flee to the Mawasi safe zone. However, Israel has repeatedly bombed regions labeled as safe zones in Gaza. This week, an Israeli strike on Mawasi killed 11 people, including 7 children who are waiting in line for water. Israel recently ramped up military operations in Gaza and is planning a full occupation in Gaza City. The IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Zamir, said the operations are already underway. We are going to increase and enhance the strides of our operation, and that is why we called you. We have already begun ground operations in Gaza City. Hamas says it is willing to release all the remaining Israeli captives if Tel Aviv agrees to a permanent end to the conflict, which Israel is unwilling to do. All right, so next up here, this is highly, highly disturbing. 21,000 Palestinian children disabled by Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The UN agency said that tens of thousands of Palestinian children have been killed or maimed by Israeli attacks in Gaza over the past 23 months. Over 18,000 Palestinian children have been killed. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities reported on Wednesday that over 40,000 Palestinian children have been injured by the Israeli war that began following the Hamas October 7th attack. Of those injured children, over half, 21,000, have been left with a disability. In August, the UN Agency for Children, UNICEF, reported over 18,000 Palestinian children have been killed by the Israeli onslaught. Official death and injury totals for Gaza are expected to be an undercount. Many bodies of murdered Palestinians do not reach hospitals or morgues, and their deaths are not recorded. A statement from the disabilities panel within the UN warned that a lack of aid and famine are increasing the risk of death of disabled Palestinians. So the panel said, in Gaza, the limited supply and access to specialized and life-saving services, medical equipment, and assistive devices led to the deaths of children and older people with disabilities. Reports highlighted the deaths due to famine, acute malnutrition, and deprivation of access to water. And so think about it. If you're a disabled person, you're bound to a wheelchair, you have to walk with a cane, you have some sort of mental disabilities that make it difficult to make plans, to follow through with those plans. You've lost an arm maybe. If you have to travel 10, 15 kilometers in order to get food, you can't do that. You can't do it and carry it back. Right? So that makes you more at risk of death. If you had to travel a kilometer to get water, well, maybe you can't get that far. Maybe you can't get that far and carry it back. And so you have to drink dirty and stagnant water. Now you have waterborne illness and you're sick and you're throwing up and you have diarrhea. That added with the malnutrition becomes absolutely lethal. Or maybe one of the worst things is if you're given an evacuation order. Israel says you got 24 hours to leave Gaza City or starting military operations there. Well, there are a lot of people who are able, even in bombed out roads, to put all the clothes that they can on their back, take their children in their hands, and start walking towards the Mawasi safe zone. However, some people can't do that. And for the people who can't do that, it's a real problem, right? And so the report from the panel says that the committee found that the early warning systems and evacuations consistently failed to protect people with disabilities. It received information that warnings and evacuation orders, including signs of explosive ordinances and text message, were often inaccessible to people with hearing and visual impairments, leaving them unable to evacuate. Reports also describe people with disabilities being forced to flee in unsafe and undignified conditions, such as crawling through the sand or mud without mobility assistance. The committee was informed that 83% had lost their assistive devices, so wheelchairs, canes, things like that, oxygen tanks probably, and could not afford alternatives such as donkey carts. There's not even a pretense that you could get a taxi or an ambulance to pick you up if you're a disabled Palestinian needing to evacuate. The best you could do in Gaza is a donkey cart. Very concerning. All right, next up here, Trump says Israel lobby is losing control of Congress. Trump seems to lament this. This is very interesting just because the Israel lobby has such an iron grip control over Congress for so long. And now there are several members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, AOC, Rashid Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, have all spoke out against what Israel is doing in Gaza. Now, as much as Trump is complaining about this, and I do think there is some real signs that Israel's iron grip over Congress is not quite the stranglehold that it once was. It's not as if there was a bill tomorrow to send $3 billion in arms and bombs to Ukraine. Big bombs that people know are going to be used to kill civilians in Gaza. Even if that came up for a vote tomorrow, it would probably get 400 votes in the House, 90 votes in the Senate. Absolutely. Right? So, as much as I do think this dynamic is starting to play out, we're certainly not there yet. Now, I do think that the Israel is losing the American people first. And that certainly will at some point impact Congress. I do think it's going to be too late, not just for Gaza, but probably for Palestine as a whole, as Israel is now moving and eyeing the annexation of the West Bank. All right, so speaking of the West Bank here, report Rubio signals the U.S. won't be opposed to Israeli occupation of the occupied West Bank. Israeli officials have told Axios that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has signed in private meetings that the U.S. won't oppose Israel if it moves to formally annex parts of the Israeli occupied West Bank, something that Israeli officials are considering doing in response to Western countries planning to recognize a Palestinian state. So bad news here. Two more stories. First, Israel is ramping up its nuclear weapons program. There's new construction going on at its secret nuclear weapons site. And, I just think this is important to highlight, as, of course, we have Iran going on in the background, this potential that the U.S. and Israel are going to go back to war with Iran over Iran's alleged, not even confirmed, probably doesn't even exist, secret nuclear weapons program. And so Israel has a completely uninspected, completely unregulated nuclear weapons program. They're adding to that program. And they're bombing Iran for trying to not even have one. They just have a civilian program. And they're bombing Iran for that. And so I think it's really important that we highlight the contrast here, that Israel, secret nuclear weapons state, not a member of the NPT, no IAEA inspectors in Israel. Iran, member of the NPT, formerly had IAEA inspectors in Iran. They only left after Israel bombed Iranian nuclear sites for 12 days along with the US. And Iran has no evidence that they have a secret nuclear weapons program. And so for the U.S. and Israel to attack Iran the way they have is just completely absurd and disgusting. Now, last story up here today, Iran path for negotiations with the U.S. is not closed. So a top Iranian official issued a statement from the country's Supreme National Security Council that said the path for negotiations with the U.S. is not closed. Yet these are the Americans who only pay lip service to talks and do not come to the table, and they wrongfully blame Iran for it. We need to pursue rational negotiations by raising unrealizable issues such as missile restrictions. They set a path which negates any talks. And so this is something the Trump and Biden administrations have done, where a deal with Iran was easily possible to achieve. Iran doesn't want nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. And so if we wanted to deal with Iran that lifted sanctions in exchange for having limitations and inspections on Iran's nuclear program that ensured Iran would never ever get a nuclear bomb, that's something that Tehran's willing to agree to. The problem is that every time the U.S. enters into negotiations, they start saying, well, not only do you have to agree on the nuclear issue, you can't have ties with Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. You can't have ties with the Houthis in Yemen. You can't have ties with Hezbollah in Lebanon. You can't have long-range missiles with a long enough range to hit Israel. And so they want Iran to essentially make themselves defenseless, to give up all their military capabilities, that if the U.S. and Israel attack Iran, they wouldn't be able to strike back. That's what they want. They want regime change in Iran, and they want to neuter the Iranian regime first. All right, everybody, that'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show today at 4:45 Eastern. It's the top link in the show notes page, so be sure that you're subscribed to that show. Additionally, follow me on ads. Help me hit that 5-figure number, 10,000 subscribers. We're just 200 short at this point. So I'm sure if the listeners of this show, everybody went and followed me on ads, we would probably get over that hill. And then, of course, check out the show sponsor, the Expat Money Summit 2025, expatmoneysummit.com.